24, 25. Oh, let's see what we got. Yeah, text 25. Naham prakasha savasha yoga maya samavrita. I am not manifested to everyone. I'm covered by yoga maya. You've heard the term yoga maya before? The term yoga maya is used in our theology, our Gaudiya theology. And it refers to Krishna's bewildering potency that bewilders the souls in Goloka Vrindavan to forget that Krishna is God. And it also bewilders Krishna himself, who forgets he's God. So yoga maya is this spiritual deluding potency that facilitates intimate love. Because if you remember that Krishna is God, you won't be able to love him intimately. You might be able to love him formally, with awe and veneration, but you won't be able to love Krishna intimately. So yoga maya is a force, a gravitational field that exists in Vrindavan and that affects both the residents of Vrindavan as well as Krishna, specifically by deluding them such that they think they're just friends and family and they don't realize that Krishna is God, which would ruin the whole thing and turn Vrindavan into Vaikuntha, where everybody's aware of God's divinity. Do you guys follow this? It's kind of Hare Krishna 101. If you don't know the term yoga maya, it's not a good sign. It's a fairly common term that we use. So, although we use that word, a compound, yoga and maya, in a very specific way in our tradition, here it would be tempting to think about it as the same word, but it's not. It's a different word. So it's the same word, it just has a different meaning. So generally speaking, maya would mean illusion, and yoga would mean power. Depending on context, yoga usually means uniting or union. So as a noun, it means union. But it can also mean power. Because what is power but the ability to unite your desires with reality? You're able to make stuff happen. You're able to take your ideas and your desires and then make them happen. That's called yoga. So yoga means power, and maya means illusion. So by my power of illusion, by my powerful illusion, by my illusory power. Now we use that term in a very specialized way. Just like we use the term lobh, which means greed. In the Gita, lobh is a gate to hell, along with lust and anger. But we use the term lobh to refer to greed of wanting to have a relationship with Krishna in the spiritual world. Lolyam also means greed. We use that term in a positive sense. Kam in the Gita means lust or desire. It's the closest thing you get to the idea of evil in the Gita. But kam, we use that word kam to refer to the gopis' love for Krishna, the intensity of that love for Krishna. So we take a lot of words that normally have a negative meaning, and then we use them in our theology in a positive way. You guys following this? But the Gita is not deep in our theology. Therefore, they're using the term yoga maya in a normative way. You just sit somewhere so I can see your face, that you're not hidden behind him. So, you following this? So, it should be obvious. If you know when you're being blocked, so just don't be behind somebody, otherwise it disturbs my mind. I can't see. So anyway, you guys don't know our tradition, so therefore you don't know how these words are used in a positive way. But if you did know our tradition, you would see that we co-opt negative terms and we use them in a positive way because we're after this really special, intimate love for Krishna, and therefore we use what would normally be sexual language or romantic language. We use that language, we co-opt it, we claim it, we repossess it, and we use it to describe great devotees' relationship with Krishna, their feeling for Krishna. So rag is a bad thing in the Gita. Rag and devesh, attraction and aversion. But we talk about cultivating rag anuga bhakti, bhakti which follows this, in the wake of passion. We talk about ragatmaka bhaktas, bhaktas, devotees in the spiritual world whose very selves are made of rag, attachment. Rati is a sexual enjoyment, sexual attachment. We sing in the morning, and we talk about Rati Keli, Krishna's love play, and we talk about Shri Guru Charane Rati, we're attached to our Guru's feet. And so we use this language, Rati, Rag, Kam, Lob, Lolyam. We use all this language, lust, anger, greed, desire, attachment, and we use it in relationship to Krishna. If you knew that, then you'd appreciate how we use the term Yoga Maya. But this is the generic usage of the term Yoga Maya, my power of illusion. So I'm not manifest to everybody. Naham sarvasya prakasha. Naham prakasha sarvasya. I'm not manifest to everybody. Yoga Maya samavrita. I'm covered by my Yoga Maya. I'm covered by my illusory potency, my power of illusion. Remember how the last verse was saying how people can't understand that they think that Krishna was unmanifested in the beginning and has now become manifested? Avyaktam vyaktim apanam manyate mama buddhaya. Ignorant people think like this. So he's following up. Why is that? Why is it that people can't see you for who you are? Why is it that everybody doesn't know you? And Krishna says, because I'm covered by my Yoga Maya. Now you could ask, you guys won't because you're too slow. But you could ask, if you were thinking fast, you could ask, well, why does God have to cover himself at all? If everybody could see God, then there wouldn't be any evil or any badness in this world. So God doesn't have to twist our arm, but at least he could show himself to us. At least he could just be present. Why is he covering himself? Why is he cheating us? He's contributing to our illusion. How would you respond to that? Yeah.
If you're going to have a genuine, loving relationship with someone, you have to have the ability to choose that, to make it a genuine choice. And if you knew someone was an all-powerful God, the creator of everything, it's going to be hard to imagine yourself on an equal level with that person. Okay, let me start over.
Yeah, you butchered it. You saw that? You ruined it. You're almost there, but I knew you were going to mess it up. I could just tell he didn't grasp it. And so you butchered it. You saw that at the end there? And what you said made no sense. You're so close, weren't you? It's okay. You'll get it next time. What?
If God or Krishna were to show us that he was God, it would take away our ability to choose to
Why?
respect him, because if we are in the presence of God, we're going to, by default, feel like we have to act a certain way, as opposed to it being something that we naturally feel inspired.
Says she got it. The mere presence of God everywhere would mitigate your free will, because it would be like living under a police officer watching you 24 hours a day. You just wouldn't be able to get up to any nonsense because you're getting watched. And so if God existed, and if God was all good and all powerful, then you think that all good God should show himself to everybody. And I'm saying no, he'd have to hide himself, because if he didn't hide himself, you'd have no free will. If you didn't have any free will, you wouldn't be able to choose him. You see that? It's so this statement, I'm not manifest to everyone. I hide myself. Yoga Maya, I'm covered by my power of illusion. It naturally leads to that question. How is it you guys were able to answer that question? You know so little about our theology. How were you able to answer that question? Do you know? I didn't answer it. I did not answer at the beginning of class. It's completely false. When did I answer at the beginning of class?
You spoke about intimacy. I guess you didn't say it specifically.
I didn't say it at all.
Okay, yes, sorry. You didn't
I didn't say it specifically. I didn't say anything that remotely resembled what you said. What you're saying is preposterous. I did not say at the beginning of class in any way, shape, or form. I talked about adjacent topics, but I also talked about adjacent topics to familial relationships and to what people do at the beach, which is they enjoy relationships with their family and friends at the beach. So it's just ridiculous to try to say I said this at the beginning of class. So absolute fail, 0. Why? Because I've explained this to you 100 times. Why have I explained it to you 100 times? Because it's an incredibly important point, and then we learn these really important points, and then you can apply them to a wide variety of theological problems you'll encounter when you study a sacred text. Not everything is spelled out in every verse. So you have to look at the whole text. Sometimes you have to look beyond a single text, but the Gita is self-sufficient, I think, in terms of basic theology. It invokes free will, and it makes a number of statements that are clearly indicate we have free will. And so the idea that we have free will combined with the idea that God hides himself from us. He even says, I reward you or I reciprocate with you as you approach me. Krishna even says that. And so there are all the building blocks you require to make this theological point within the Gita. But it's like you're given, flour and water and yeast. And then you can make bread, but it's not the same as being given a piece of bread. Some things in the Gita, you're just handed a piece of bread. Other things in the Gita, you're given, throughout the text, you're given enough stuff that you can put it together. Why would Krishna not, I've made this point to you guys 100 times, why would Krishna not have made this point to you guys 100 times in the Gita? That you have free will, and that's why I don't show myself to you, and you're the cause of your own suffering. I mean, he makes related points, but he never says it the way I'm saying it right now. Why doesn't he say it like that? I don't show myself to you because it would take away your free will. He definitely never says that. Why doesn't Krishna say that in the Gita? Because it wasn't an issue for the Vedic people. They didn't have a concept of evil. They didn't have a concept of evil, and therefore they didn't have a concept of like Satan, and they didn't have to explain where evil comes from. They had a pure soul theology. The worst you had was illusion, and that wasn't the real you. That was just covering you. And in a tradition that doesn't have a concept of evil and merely has a concept of temporary illusion, the necessity of explaining away the problem of evil becomes relatively small. And so it just doesn't seem like this was an issue for the Gita. Now, the core building blocks, that God exists, that you exist, that you have free will, that the ability is there to love God, that God doesn't show himself to you automatically, that he reciprocates as you approach him. All the building blocks are there. Like flour and water and yeast and salt. It's just not all put together. And there is sometimes a little work to do. Specifically, there's a little work to do about things like the problem of evil. What's another topic that requires work that you can't quite, find just fully fleshed out in the Gita? You have to go to, other places in our tradition to find. Yeah?
Karma?
No, karma's all over the Gita. No idea where'd you get the idea karma was all over the Gita?
Why karma must exist for there to be an all-good, all-powerful God?
That's the problem of evil. You've said nothing. What other problems there? You realize you said nothing?
No.
You're really not firing all cylinders. Go ahead.
So the different kinds of familial
That's right. You don't find Vrindavan and romantic relations with Krishna. Maybe slight, like little slight things that you could kind of read between the lines, but nothing direct like that, right? Yeah. You don't even find a full definition of bhakti. You find a definition of yoga. Yoga is this. Yoga is this. 3 definitions of yoga. But there is no bhakti is this. The word bhakti is used, but it's not defined like in a rigorous way. That's another text you have to go to for a rigorous definition of bhakti. It's used, it exists, but it's not rigorously defined. So it doesn't, but the basics, a basic worldview, with the exception of the problem of evil, is dealt with in the Gita. And I think, I'm offering an opinion, it just didn't seem to be that big of a deal for the Vedic people. And so, sometimes you do that. You read an old book and you've got your concerns, but it just doesn't seem like those concerns were shared by the other people. Like in this country, there's a whole thing with reparations and the evils of slavery. 150 years ago, roughly in this country, maybe 160 at this point, it was still legal in many states to own another human being. And we got, about 12.5 million slaves made the Middle Passage. That's from Africa to, you have all the way from Angola up to West Africa, kind of all along that seaboard. You had slaves being brought over, from about the mid-1500s up until the mid-1800s. Over that period of time, especially it heated up, last 150 years or so. It really heated up, and they were bringing a lot of slaves every year. And 12.5 million slaves, about a little over 10.5 million of them made it. 1.82 million of them perished. The journey was so rough that, about 20%, a little less, 15% didn't even make it. They died on the boat on the way over. And then the slaves in the U.S. had a much higher rate of life expectancy. We only got in the U.S. about 6-7% of the slaves that made the Middle Passage. Over 90% went to the Caribbean, Haiti, Guyana, Brazil, that South America, Central America, which is why you have such a large black population in those countries. There's a lot of, remorse and well-reasoned blame that people in the U.S. talk about, think about in terms of the crime against humanity, the really sadistic and undefendable, unjustifiable crime against humanity that slavery was. And our slavery was really bad. Other countries had slavery, but the slaves had some rights. They could even win their freedom. They had some rights, some representation in government, and you couldn't just do anything to them. In the U.S., it was chattel slavery. A slave was no different than owning a guitar. If you want to throw your guitar in a fire and burn it, who can stop you? So that was the kind of slavery that was existed in the U.S. Property. Slaves were property. Now, over 90% of the slaves that came from Africa, so 12.5 million, over 90% of them were sold into slavery by Africans. Did you know that? Yeah, over 90.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, over 90. Like the vast, vast majority. And if you look at Africans and African philosophers and African leaders and African politicians, descendants of slave owners in Africa, slave traders, they don't feel guilt about it. Obviously, there may be some, but the ones who write about it and talk about it and are interviewed about the subject, there's a sense in Africa that they don't blame themselves for what their forefathers did. They don't carry that guilt. But here we carry that guilt. Now they enriched themselves just as people in the U.S. enriched themselves. They were the genesis of practically the whole black diaspora population of the world. That's how black people got around the world. Is they were sold into slavery and they migrated to other places, and that's why you have black populations all over the world, including in England for that matter. England had slavery too. They finished it off before we did, but they had it too. They were a huge part of the slave trade. There was a triangle. You'd bring slaves to the U.S., trade them, get cotton and sugar from the Caribbean and from the U.S., and then you would take it to England. And then that would be traded and you make money. So you make money by taking the goods, then you get that money, you go back down to Africa, pick up more slaves, go and sell the slaves, get cotton, and then go sell it and make money, and it was like a really lucrative business. It was like 80,000 slaves at the heyday of the whole thing per year. So a lot of people. Might seem like a small number, but the population of the world was just so much smaller then. Such a large amount of people coming in the U.S. It's interesting, as you empathize, you think about it, you might think, oh, they would also feel lousy about what was done. They would also feel guilty. You follow? But it wasn't quite like that. Then you would think, well, how could you sell your brothers into slavery, right? But they didn't. There was no Pan-African sense of unity and identity along racial lines, like that. We are African, we're black, we are collectively a group. It was tribal, and so you never sold your own people into slavery. You only sold other groups into slavery. So there were different languages and different customs and different dress. There were some universal features, but you growing up in Africa a few hundred years ago, you were from your tribe. You did not identify with people from another tribe. They weren't your people. They were your enemy. And so selling them to slavery, they weren't your people. It was war. You get it? You got rid of them. Now they can't come after you. You defeat them, you sell them to slavery. You get money, you get guns. They especially want guns. You get guns. Now you can defeat your enemies, like really defeat your enemies. And then they can't come back and get you because you sold them off into slavery. Without something like slavery and them, getting taken 1,000 miles away, you got to start cutting off hands. That's a kind of a common thing that you find African warlords doing. They cut off the hands of kids. Because why? Because 20 years from now, those kids are going to grow up and seek revenge for you burning down their village and killing their family. So what do? You cut their hands off so they're not as capable of fighting. You know about this, right? It's a whole different way of thinking about the world. And so sometimes when you study a culture, you want to import your ideas. And sometimes there are universal things that are true in every culture. You do find, universals. The taboo against child molestation, they say, is universal. But there's some pre-civilization tribes in Papua New Guinea that practice ritual child abuse, sexual abuse. And so it's not that that's even an absolute universal in human society. And of course, they don't think of it as being sexual abuse. They think of it as being their culture. And so when you're studying another culture, when you're studying another language, when you're studying another text, you have to use your own experience of life as your starting point. Why? Did you hear what I said? No. Keep it together, dude. You already came to class. Keep it together. You have to use your own life as a starting point. When you study another culture, another people, another group, another book, you have to use your own life experiences and your own value system as a starting point. Why?
It's the only way to actually understand.
It's the only way to do anything. But you have to do it with a light touch. Open to the idea that other people may not view the world the way you do. You have to use a light touch. And so in the Gita, it's like, oh, you should feel bad about slavery. Well, maybe. Maybe the Africans aren't as to blame as people in the U.S. Maybe people in the U.S. are more to blame. Maybe they enrich themselves more. Maybe they created the demand, which created the supply. Maybe not. Maybe it's just two different cultures and two different ways of viewing the world. You follow? And so when you study another group of people, you want to enforce your value system on them. You want to hold them to your standard. Your standard makes sense to you. You assume everybody else should follow it. But the world doesn't actually work like that. Like, let me give you a simple example. If you go back in time, maybe it's changing gradually, but if you go back in time, maybe 30 years, your average Indian got an arranged marriage. So it's a lot of people. The Hindus are like whatever, 90% they were at that time, and 800 million people or something like that. So you're talking about, at that point, it was well over 10% of the world's population. The world's population maybe 5 million people, and so at that time it would have been, well over maybe 15% of the world's population, something like that. 1 out of 7 people. They got an arranged marriage. Arranged marriages sound awful, right? Totally unconscionable, right? But they did it. They had no divorce rate. This is like 0.1 of 1% divorce rate 30 years ago. Now maybe it's 1%. The U.S. is 50%. And it just goes up. You get married a second time or third time, your rates go up. I think it's 65% number 2 and 75% number 3. It's just insane. And so now you could say, well, that's worse. Husbands were beating their wives or raping their wives. They had nowhere they could go. There were no shelters. You can make that argument. Hard to get statistics. Husbands are beating their wives here. Rape's going on here. Murder's going on here. It's hard to get exact statistics. The U.S. is so far above India in terms of eradicating domestic violence, stuff like that. But you can make an argument, but the fact remains, for a huge chunk of the world's population, 10% even still now, they just get arranged marriages, and it works for them. And they're peaceful. Gets rid of the trauma of having to try and date people and figure it out. Is it this one or is it that one? And compromise your integrity and compromise your morals, and then you humiliate yourself and embarrass yourself and just go off on your own and spend 5 or 10 years of your life, multiple sexual partners, and just so much heartache and so much wear and tear on your mind and your body. It avoids all that. It avoids all that. Can you say for certain from every angle of vision it's worse? You follow? And so the problem of evil is a great contribution of Western philosophy and Western theology to the world. It's a very valuable, because it also covers the problem of suffering as a corollary. And it really didn't exist. So we can find enough pieces to bake a cake, to bake some cookies, to bake some bread, but we don't find it pre-baked. There's other stuff that's just pre-baked. It's served you on a platter. The idea that the soul is pure, the idea of karma, the idea of yoga, of self-realization, of overcoming dualities. Very avant-garde and exotic ideas in the West, but they're just, every Indian taxi driver knows them. But the problem of evil is it takes a little more work. And I've always thought it's because they had a pure soul theology. They conceived of ignorance, not of a true evil per se. Ignorance was temporary. It was just another form of illusion. And therefore, didn't bite as hard, and it didn't require as much mitigation. It's like if you have like an infestation of ants, it's like, all right, whatever. We deal with an infestation of ants, You have an infestation of wasps. It's like, that's another pro. You know what I mean? That's like, oh, we got to call somebody immediately. We got to deal with that right away. You can't have an infestation of wasps. That's insane. And so it was more like an ant situation, whereas in the West it was a wasp situation. It's the problem of evil. But you do find, you find questions. I'm not manifest everyone. I cover myself by my illusion power. Why is God covering himself at all? Well, as a service to us, because we don't want to see him. Because he says, as you approach me, I'll reciprocate with you. He says I'm aloof unless you approach me, in which case I'm available. He says, I love you so much, I'll tell you one more time. The greatest secret that's for your benefit is if you just become my devotee, you'll for sure come to me. You'll know me in truth. I'll protect you. I'll carry what you lack, preserve what you have, enlighten you, give you inspiration. There's enough there to get a loving deity who's available, who's bending over backwards, but who's not quite removing our free will. If God removes your free will, it's called monergism as opposed to synergism. And then you got a problem. If it's a monergistic world we live in, which is the world of John Calvin, the famous Protestant theologian. And so if we live in a world of a monergistic world where God is responsible for your salvation, there's nothing you can do about it, then every bad thing that ever happened is God's fault because you live in a fully deterministic world. Does that make sense? And that's a serious problem. Anyway, I think it's important when you read a text, you see what they're saying, you allow questions to occur, you troubleshoot them, you figure out where you're pulling your answers from, how you're navigating through the text, whether it's from the text itself or from outside the text. This is important stuff to notice. And now we're awake. Mudho ayam na abhijanati loko mam ajam avyayam. The world is deluded. The deluded, the foolish, they don't know me. The world doesn't know me. The foolish, the world doesn't know me. They don't understand me. Abhijanati means they don't understand me. Who am ajam, who am unborn, and avyayam, who am eternal. I am never manifest to the foolish and unintelligent. For them I am covered by my internal potency, and therefore they do not know that I am unborn and infallible. It sounds a little Christian, doesn't it? It's a little like heavy-handed, right? So it's good to have this kind of troubleshooting. Vedaham samatitani vartamani charjuna bhavishani chabutani. So I know the dead, the living, and those beings who will be born, who will come to life. Mam tu veda nakaschana. But there's not anyone that knows me. I know everything that's happened in the past, all that's happening in the present, and all things that are yet to come. Prabhupada generalizes it to not being about beings, but about past, present, and future. I also know all living entities. There it goes. There it goes. He's adding the living entities as the fourth thing, as opposed to being the past, future, and present living beings. He's saying, I know these three things, and also living beings. So he's breaking it into four. Otherwise, you have to attach the beings that will come, which then makes you think beings that are currently existing, and then beings in the past. You follow? So that's what it is. But me, no one knows. Okay, why don't they know Krishna? It's a natural question to ask, isn't it? What's the answer? Why don't they know Krishna? Why is it covered?
Because he's trying to give us free will.
So an easier way to answer that question, we would say, why don't we know Krishna? Does not make me ask you multiple questions and you have to struggle and wade through the mud. When I ask the question, why don't we understand Krishna? The simple answer is,
We don't want to.
boom. See that? We don't want to. And therefore he covers himself, and therefore he remains remote. You got it? Good. Icha dvesha samutena, desire and hatred arising. Dvandva mohena. And by the arising of desire and hatred, by the being bewildered by dualities. Dvandva mohena bharata. Sarva bhutani sammoham. All living beings are an illusion. Sarge yanti. Upon being born, they go to illusion. They become illusioned. Parantapa. O Kanka, all living beings are born into delusion, bewildered by dualities arising from desire and hate. So it's just more of the same, right? Krishna's saying, I exist, but people worship demigods, they worship the impersonal, they don't understand me. And then you ask, well, why? And then Krishna says, because I'm covered for you. And then you have to answer the question, why is he covered? And you've got to look around the text, figure that one out. And so you're in illusion, you're in duality, you're an enjoyer. You want to enjoy, and therefore you're, from the moment you're born to the moment you die. I know everything, but you don't. You're small, I'm big. And you got to troubleshoot these verses. These verses require a little troubleshooting. Now, somebody could say, oh, why are you troubleshooting? Just let the verses speak for themselves. Well, the thing is, the verses do speak for themselves, but not every single point that you might have a question about can be answered in each individual verse. Therefore, you have to look at the totality of verses in the text, and if there's a question that arises from reading one verse, you have to look at other verses in the same text, chapter, that will help you to then make sense out of the verse. Because it's just not possible to say everything in every verse. And therefore you're going to have to build ideas, and those ideas are going to be confusing at the beginning, and they're not going to be fully understood. Just like if you're teaching somebody something and they just ask you, why, like every single time. How do you know that? 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 And you're like a kid. At some point, you're like, hey, just roll with me. Just take the ride with me. We'll get there. Save your questions till the end. We'll get there. We'll figure it out. Let's see if you still have questions at the end. So I don't see it as a fault that each verse isn't complete unto itself and you have to look at different places in the text. Additionally, I don't find it to be a fault because I don't think the Vedic peoples were that worried about the problem of evil, the problem of suffering. It's kind of our thing. And if you want to discuss it with people, you can, but you have to take into account their worldview. It's interesting, right? Like how appropriate it would be for like white people to fly to Africa and try to explain to the descendants of the African slave traders that they should feel more guilt about what they did. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Right? They have a different world they live in, right? Why is that our place? Well, because we did it together. I didn't do it. I'm a Serb. My family came over here in the 1920s, 1930s. We're new. Been here less than a century. So, it's not me. You, on the other hand, you're from Virginia. I had no idea what's going on in your past. But, why aren't we jumping on planes to fly over, like you Virginians, to go over there and talk to people, and talk to your counterparts and tell them to feel more guilt? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Right? Yeah. Sometimes you meet people and they have a different worldview, and it's not necessarily right or wrong. That's another conversation. But they got a worldview, and you got to roll with it. I think it's more justifiable that slaves were sold in military campaigns, in these blood feuds, as opposed to they were purchased just to enrich people and make them wealthy. It seems a little bit more justifiable. But part of the justification comes from the idea that people think, oh, they were just tribal warlords. Ergo, they weren't that intelligent. They weren't that civilized. Therefore, they can't be held accountable for the heinous crimes against humanity they committed. Somewhere in people's minds, that's a factor. I don't think that argument holds up. It's a bit paternalistic and a bit patronizing, if not extremely racist. Which is a weird, ironic thing, right? You hate on the African slave traders, it makes you less racist than if you give them a pass. So, I just thought of this as because it shows you what a quagmire it is when you take the values of one culture, try and transplant it onto another culture. There's some negotiation that has to be done. And so when you're reading a text, you got to see what they're trying to say, where they're trying to communicate, what's on their plate, what do they want to communicate, where are they coming from. But you can't just let go of all of your ideas because it's part of how you view the world. If you came up with a tradition that was still endorsing slavery, that would be a problem. I'd be like, okay, I don't want to be a part of that tradition. You come across a tradition that's severely anti-gay. It's like, okay, I don't want to be part of that tradition. Maybe I won't take my value system, but it'll at least tell me enough that I don't want to participate. You follow? There's no way to not, on some level, import your value system. You just got to do it carefully. Not assuming everybody thinks like you. And then maybe they think better than you. Maybe they're more advanced than you in some way. Maybe they have some concepts that'll blow your mind that you should adopt into your own life. Maybe it's not just that you know the best and you just have to convince them that you know the best. Maybe you got something to learn from them. yesham tu antagatam papam. But for those whose sins have come to an end, jnananam punyakarmanam, for those people who are pious, who do pious deeds, te dvandva moha nirmukta, they who are freed from the illusion of duality. Bhajante mam dridha vrata, they worship me with strong vows. This is interesting. What's being said here? Let me read it to you again. For those whose sins have come to an end, for those who do pious activities, they are liberated from the illusion of duality, and they worship me with great vows. What's Krishna saying here? You guys missed it.
I was saying you never start at square one, like you never start on a blank slate. All the pious acts and all.
That's true, but that's not how it fits. You'll see. How's it fit? You guys don't see it. Listen carefully. Krishna's making the point that although you might be born into illusion, although you might be overwhelmed by illusion, although he might be covered to you, he doesn't have to be. If you're ready to turn your life around, then okay. You're not being held back. You know, one of the terrible things about slavery in the U.S. Was that the children of the slaves became the property of their owners. It wasn't always like that. Sometimes the children of slaves were free. But in the U.S., it was, and we imported a lot of women slaves. And women slaves commanded a high price. And we encouraged slaves to have children. Because then we got more people to work in the fields. It's kind of insidious, right? It's kind of nasty, right? And that, created the problem of you ever heard like don't sell me down the river, or you sold me down the river? That's because like the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, those places led you to Louisiana, which was like the worst. They treated the slaves the worst there. And they'd break up your family. So they'd sell you down the river. If you misbehaved, you wouldn't be able to be with your family. Interesting, right? They'd take you away from your wife, take you away from your children. And so it was like hell. It was perpetual bondage. There was no way out. And so as Krishna outlines the bondage and the suffering that we are born into, that we go to, that we suffer from, he's obliged to mention that it doesn't have to be like that. And this verse is that. You see how important it is? You see how it's better than the point you were making? It's incredibly important to complete this idea, right? That you're in illusion, that you're suffering, you're bound, but you don't have to be. You don't have to be. One of the problems, like the Catholic Church is like, the desire to be gay is not sinful. It's just if you act on it. And like a lot of people think that's like, oh yeah, I'm a progressive. Like I'm a progressive. I don't fault you for having gay desires. It's just the acting on them is what's sinful. And God gave you a special challenge because He knew you were ready for it. It's funny, but you guys know what pederasty is? Pederasty is this really old practice that goes back at least as far as ancient Greece and probably somewhere else too. I don't know, but and it also existed in British society up until relatively recently. It's kind of just a weird feature where every rich aristocratic male would take a young teenage-ish lover and have this well-to-do Greek person is married with children, but then they take on an extramarital lover, and this is socially sanctioned. And in fact, if you read Plato's Symposium, it's about this. So the work is highly homoerotic. And Socrates was famous because he didn't do this. He was unusual for not doing this. And gives a whole new meaning to platonic love. But and there was a swingers club in New York in the 70s and 80s called Plato's something. And so they obviously knew history. Somebody read some history. It was like Plato's Nest or Plato's clubhouse or something like that. But I thought it was amazing because what you have there is you have kind of socially structured homosexuality. Now, the naturally homosexual percentage of the population around the world is around 5%, maybe as low as 3%, maybe as high as 7%. But, this means that 19 out of 20 Greek men were not gay. But it was just so socially structured and baked into the society's value system that these guys ended up, they ended up it was like a reverse beard situation, It was like instead of pretending to be straight or going through conversion therapy, they were going through conversion therapy to become gay. It shows you how baked in our value system is, right? How society's ideas just become your ideas. You don't even know. People thought slavery is okay. They're just raised on it. Couldn't even think outside that bubble. Sit normally. Don't do yoga here. Wild, right? So it's like the Mormons, it's okay to be gay, just don't ever act on it. That's a rough thing to accept. Like imagine saying, you're straight, that's okay. You could marry a same-sex person if you want to. Otherwise, you can be celibate for the rest of your life. I don't think it's wrong for you to have straight desires, but you just can never act on them. You follow? It's like mind-bending if you flip the script. And so you can't necessarily just abandon your value system, but you should learn to question it. You should learn to encounter another value system without automatically and narrow-mindedly insulting it and conceiving of it as being fundamentally wrong. You should look to see what you can learn from other cultures. You should walk carefully, tread carefully, see what they're saying. Bring in your own value system. Challenge the text. Challenge the culture. Have a conversation. But start from the point of view of this, they don't necessarily believe what I believe. And perhaps my way of viewing things isn't the only way to view them. Persons who've acted piously in previous lives and this life, and whose sinful reactions are completely eradicated, are fixed, freed from dualities of delusion, and they engage themselves in my service with determination. This verse is so critical to troubleshoot the previous verses, because it says that, even though you might be born into this situation due to your karma, even though you might be illusioned, even though that illusion blocks you from seeing me, even though I actively participate in not showing myself to you, it doesn't have to be that way. You're free. And you have to change your life. You have to become a little less sinful. You have to become a little more pious. You have to change your activity. And that'll open some doors for you to see something else, to realize something else. See how important it is? You missed it though, right?
Yeah.
You missed it completely, right? But if you're thinking the way I'm thinking, and you're seeing these problems, and you're navigating the text the way we are, then a verse like this comes up and it's like it fits like the piece into the puzzle. It's just a crucial piece, and now you're like, now I got it. It's like that final letter that you order on that Wheel of Fortune, and then what's up on the board, what thing's up on the board. Does that make sense? Okay. Thank you, IGTV. What do you got?